He is as Wisconsin as cheese curds. You can find him at governorbluejeans.com. He is a candidate for governor for the Democratic Party, Mike McCabe, and he is back on Busted Pencils. So welcome back, Mike.
Thanks for having me back.
I'm surprised you came back.
I'm not.
You're not?
I'm delighted you asked, and that's an easy one to say yes to.
Well, because I
haven't busted any pencils for a while.
We got yelled at for busting pencils, and some teachers are running short of supplies, and so we had a so-called guest call in and say, you shouldn't be busting pencils when teachers need those pencils. So it is a metaphor, right?
Yeah.
Okay, so hopefully that's. But you're going to bust some pencils pretty soon.
Happy to.
All right, so we talked, it's been probably 4 months, but a lot has happened, and it's an education. What education have you received being on the trail?
This has been an unbelievable experience. We've traveled over 60,000 miles just since I announced my candidacy back in September. Have gone to every part of the state. The unbelievable part of this experience is that we all live in bubbles. And this is one of those rare opportunities to travel from bubble to bubble to bubble. I get to go in other people's bubbles and hear and see what they're dealing with and what they're riled up about. And it's just incredible. And it's a tremendous blessing to be able to just listen to what's on people's minds.
I was going to say, so did you burst any of those bubbles?
Well, I'll tell you,
or is it more of a learning?
It's a learning experience. You gain incredible insight about what people are frustrated about, struggling with, challenged by, all across the state, and it varies from place to place. There are certainly some common themes that come up everywhere you go, okay. But then there are also some unique issues that are brought up depending on which region of the state you're in.
And I will spend a few minutes talking about those common themes, and then we will hit really hard education. But I mean, give me one of the common themes you keep hearing.
Everything from the inability of so many people to find work that pays a living wage, the inability of people to actually work and be in the middle class. That's huge. Roads and transportation infrastructure, that's an issue everywhere. Water, access to clean, drinkable water. And that's something that it manifests itself differently. In Milwaukee, it's lead pipes. It's also lead in the water in Lake Mills. But then you go to western Wisconsin, sand mining is affecting the water quality. You go to places like Kewaunee County or Calumet County in the east, and there it's indiscriminate manure spreading, and people can't turn on a water faucet and drink what comes out because their water is poisoned. Schools are obviously on people's minds everywhere. Healthcare is a theme that comes up everywhere. Access to healthcare and the ability to afford to go to the doctor. But yeah, I mean, schools, that comes up everywhere.
And so good. Then you led right into it.
Yep.
So what is it about schools? What comes up? What's the issue?
Well,
issues.
When you get out into rural Wisconsin, they are scared to death about having to bus their kids an extra 45 minutes or an hour on top of what they're already traveling to get to school, because they're afraid that they're going to have to close their local elementary school or maybe even their local high school. And I grew up in Clark County, and not far from a little town named Dorchester. Dorchester's right now going through the agonizing process of deciding whether to close their local elementary school and bus the kids off to Abbotsford.
How much of that, just because the critic might say, look, we have a population that's declining. The number of children enrolled in schools is smaller. These school districts are shrinking. They have to, quote, consolidate, move, and that this is just the reality of living in rural Wisconsin. Or is it a mechanized, as some people would say, no, it's a defunding.
I don't think there's any question that it's been defunding. And you look at since the 2008 recession, since the Great Recession, Wisconsin's in the top 10 of states that have seen their education funding shrink the most. That's not a good top 10 list to be on. But we're right up near the top. And in the early years of the Walker administration, Wisconsin was actually leading the nation in cuts to funding and education. Now, he added back a little bit in this most recent budget. Right. But we're still lagging badly, and we're still solidly in the top 10 when it comes to states that have watched education funding decline the most of all the states around the country. So, and that's really hit with the force of a bomb in small rural communities, because they were already sort of living on the edge, and now that's pushing a lot of them over the edge, and they just don't have the ability to keep their doors open.
So it's interesting though too. You said bubble, so that's a bubble, rural Wisconsin, and you're talking about schools, but you said something very unique. They're concerned about the loss of their local elementary school, and yet funding cuts. And what I wonder about is, do they have a sense, or are the people you're talking to have a sense as to who is responsible for the possibility that they might lose their public school?
They assume that the folks in charge at the Capitol are responsible. Although some of them will just blame their local school board members or the local administrators. They just know that their school's in trouble, and that concerns them, because when a local school closes, that's a death sentence for that small town.
Right.
That's such a hub of community activity. But here's the interesting thing, Tim. The more Republicans foul up government, those who are in charge of our state government right now, the more they foul it up, the easier it is for them to win elections, because people go for the default option of voting for the anti-government party. When they're frustrated about government dysfunction, when they think government is failing them, they actually then are more inclined to vote for the anti-government party. So that's a dilemma for Democrats.
And that's where I was going with this too, to talk about, again, everybody's different, but there is kind of a voting perspective in rural Wisconsin that would typically favor Walker and the Republicans. However, if we would look at, if we say budget cuts are the biggest devastating hit to local small rural counties, then when you present an alternative or something like this, is there pushback? Wait, Walker wouldn't do this. He's anti-government. My local Republican wouldn't do this. How do you wrestle with that?
Actually, they're all ears. And the thing is, I think Democrats haven't made them a better offer for a long time, and Republicans have very skillfully peddled an anti-government message. And when people are frustrated with government, they listen to that message, and it resonates with them, and they go ahead and vote Republican. But when somebody goes out there and actually is willing to listen to them and actually travel to their communities, they don't see many candidates for governor come their way. And when somebody's actually willing to go out there and listen, and then say, look, we need to restore local democracy. We need to restore some local control. You've had your own ability to make decisions about your schools and so many other issues in your local community taken away from you by those who are in charge at the Capitol. We really ought to restore local democracy, and we ought to make sure that every school everywhere has decent funding, because that's critical to your community's health. You lose your local school, that is a death sentence for your small town. They get all that, and they're all ears. They're saying, okay, tell us more. How do we do this?
Right. And then when
they're open to a different message. They've been written off for too long. Democrats have stopped competing out in places like where I'm from.
Okay, because I wanted to know it when you say you give them, and they're all ears, and you say, okay, so then vote for me, a Democrat. Do the ears go, I can't do that?
Some do. There are some people who have become very tribal about politics, and they can't veer from their party. But I think you're seeing a rapidly shifting political landscape out in more rural parts of the state. I think people are feeling very written off and very forgotten, and they're frustrated. They feel looked down upon. They kind of feel like all the people in the Capitol must not even know they're out there. And they want something better than that, and I think they're open to change. So you don't have to win everybody over. You just got to win over enough people to create governing majorities. And I think some votes can be had out in rural Wisconsin.
We are talking to Democratic candidate for governor, Mike McCabe. When we get back, I want to come after this point, though, Mike. You talk about Democrats' lack of responding to particularly issues in education. Mike, you hinted at the possibility that on education, Democrats, maybe in fact in the rural areas and maybe all across the state, have not been very good at responding to the concerns. What do you, or yes, no?
Well, I think in general, Democrats have focused on places like Madison and Milwaukee.
Okay.
And they've neglected other parts of the state, even written off other parts of the state where they just don't go out and compete. And so they don't go out and talk to people about school issues. And I think also on education issues specifically, Democrats have played along with a lot of the education reform initiatives that we've seen in recent years or even in the last decade or two that have primarily been driven by the right. We're just testing kids to death now. Where all of this, all of it was done in the name of accountability, but we're not letting teachers teach. We're not letting students learn. We're forcing teachers to just teach to the test, and then we're testing the kids to death, all in the name of education reform, all in the name of education accountability. And then, of course, Democrats went along with revenue limits and teacher salary caps, and they sort of bought into all of that as well, and in the name of keeping property taxes low.
Neoliberalism is the big thing that comes through.
And all of it has pushed schools to the brink of collapse, particularly in rural areas. It's demoralized teachers across the state and led a whole bunch of teachers to flee the profession. And then you got fewer young people wanting to enter the profession. Fewer are going into teacher training. And that sets us up for disaster over the long haul. And local communities are struggling to keep their schools alive, and it's important for a small town to keep its school alive. Its community's existence depends on it, and they haven't heard really new thinking from Democrats. So Democrats have got to go out there with, I think, a much more bold and ambitious agenda and a message that isn't same old on education.
Was that you?
Well, everywhere I go, I talk about how we can't afford to continue to fund two separate and parallel systems of education. One public and one private. I've called for ending taxpayer-subsidized private schooling. I refuse to call it the choice program,
right?
Because it doesn't provide people choices that they didn't already have. The vast majority of voucher recipients already were privately schooling their kids. They already had the choice to send their kids to private schools. The only thing that's changed is now all taxpayers subsidize that decision. Mm-hmm. And I've called for ending that so that we can reroute the resources to our public schools and do justice by funding community schools and strengthen them.
And I've heard a majority of the Democrats running say something along those lines.
They're coming along.
You've been definitely much more clear as to saying these things. But, I want to go back, though, to some of the more...
But think about it, Tim. For years, Democrats were only willing to say, well, maybe we should limit the further expansion of the voucher program, or maybe we should hold voucher schools a little bit more accountable. And I said, no, if a program's 27 years old and hasn't delivered the promised results, you end that program and you use the funding for a more constructive purpose. Now some of the candidates, after hearing that, are starting to say, well, me too. I kind of think that way as well. But yeah, in this campaign, we're really changing the conversation. I was the first to come out for ending taxpayer-subsidized private schooling. I was the first to come out to say we should make Badger Care a public option available to everybody in the state, regardless of income. I was the first to say that we should fully legalize marijuana to deal with the impact of how that impacts mass incarceration. Now you've got quite a few of the other candidates sort of joining me on some of those positions. That's one of the ways that I've been able to change the conversation. But the education debate needed changing in the worst way.
Yeah, and so we've moved it on choice. That's great. But let's get back to, I think, maybe, I don't know which one's bigger or not, but you talked about demoralization of teachers, which is something that we talk a lot about on Busted Pencils. We have teachers out there. I know right here where we broadcast the show, or where we record the show here in Madison, I've got at least 5 to 7 teachers that I know are on their way out, and has nothing to do with not loving kids, not wanting to be an awesome teacher, has everything to do with demoralization and the conditions. And you started hinting about that, but what is it? When do Democrats learn to make the connection, or are you starting to make the connection to saying we're setting up teachers for failure, not only our schools?
Well, a long time ago, I was involved in education work and actually was appointed to a statewide task force on school funding, and we came up with the idea of the SAGE program, which was to reduce class sizes to 15 in the early grades. And the SAGE program was, in fact, that recommendation was put into effect for a while. Walker got rid of it eventually. One of the things we can do to help teacher morale is to put them in a situation where it's easier for them to succeed. Give them smaller, more manageable class sizes. Give them better supports when they're dealing with a really high need group of kids with developmental disabilities. Make sure that there are assistants or aides in that classroom so that they don't spend all of their time managing the behavior of one or two kids and neglecting everybody else in the classroom. And then, of course, Act 10 is not a sustainable policy over the long haul. Mm-hmm. And when we've got a situation where more and more veteran teachers are leaving early and fewer young people are entering the profession, going into teacher training, that's a recipe for disaster. So that says to me that over the long haul, what we've done with school budgets and with teacher compensation is not sustainable. We've got to, so there are all these ways that we can address the root causes of declining teacher morale, but there hasn't been the political leadership to direct the conversation in that way.
Well, so I finally hear somebody starting to get at a little bit of this, and I appreciate that you're going there, because it makes me then push the issue that I've been pushing hard, which is, do we have a teacher shortage or do we have a teacher exodus? And if you label one way, you come up with a solution. If you label one the other way, you might have different solutions.
Right.
And so I'll throw it, and I asked you this the first time, but I'll throw it back at you again. Now it's late. What do you think?
I think teachers are fleeing, which makes it an exodus.
Okay, so
it's not just a shortage of there's. It's not just that there's too small a pool of possible teachers out there. We're actually having teachers fleeing. Mm-hmm. And then we're having fewer and fewer young people seeing it as an appealing option to pursue the teaching profession. So that looks to me like an exodus, not a shortage.
Okay, so we've labeled it then, if we go with that. So this hopefully has some policy implications for solving it. And, what I've seen right now coming out of Wisconsin, whether it be Democrats or Republicans, largely Democrats, has been this idea of alternative routes, emergency certification, faster. We need to send as many untrained people into our classrooms as we possibly can quickly because the shortage. And for you talk about unsustainable.
Yeah, what a disastrous approach. The response to school districts having an opening and no applicants, the response has been, well, let's just lower the standards of preparation for teachers so we can pretty much let anybody get in the classroom and then we'll be able to fill those openings. No, we got to look at the actual root causes of why you have openings and no applicants. And that does deal with classroom conditions, class sizes, the level of support that teachers have for the student populations they're trying to serve, teacher compensation. All of those are factors that are going to determine whether somebody wants to keep working in that classroom. And if you don't address that stuff, then it's a race to the bottom. We just will continue to lower standards and say pretty much anybody can go in a classroom. And I've been in enough classrooms and I've worked with enough teachers and I've been around schools enough to know it is a really, really hard job to teach. And not everybody can do it. Certainly not everybody can do it well. And it takes some real serious preparation and expertise. We need to raise standards for teacher preparation, not lower them. We're going in exactly the opposite direction we should be going in, as far as I'm concerned. That's tragic, and to the extent that Democrats buy into that, as well as Republicans, I think that's just a vacuum of leadership that needs to be addressed in our state.
Well, Mike, maybe there's going to be an opportunity to fill that vacuum here.
It sure needs to be filled. That's right.
So, Mike, if I'm interested in the campaign, where do I go?
GovernorBlueJeans.com is the website, and you can also find us on Facebook and on Twitter and all the social media. But
anywhere you're going to be, if anybody you want to, in the next week or so.
Oh man, it's just
you're going to be everywhere.
I was just in La Crosse, going to Whitewater, and then Fort Atkinson, and then Milwaukee, and I'm all over the state.
And
every
I know
day.
we're also going to see you on May 12th at Educators Amplified in Milwaukee for that special governor's
That's right.
race. And so that's actually hosted by Busted Pencils there, too. So
Terrific.
we'll get to talk again.
Terrific.
And maybe even get some of these other Democrats on the record here. So
Terrific.
But, hey, Mike McCabe, good luck out there. And, look both ways when you cross.
Will do. Thanks, Tim.